Judge Hammond Bledsoe leaned back in his chair and let the gallery see him smile before he answered. "So let me understand this," he said, looking down over his glasses at the boy standing alone at the defense table, hands folded, chin level. "You threw a tray in the cafeteria, and now you're telling my courtroom it was self-defense. That's a very big word for a very small incident, son. You sure you didn't just want to see what happened when you let it fly?" A ripple of laughter moved through the gallery. A few parents, a bailiff who caught himself and stopped, and Elijah Dunbar, 12 years old, narrow-shouldered in a blazer 2 sizes too large that his mother had bought him for exactly this kind of morning, did not laugh, did not flinch, did not look away from the bench. He stood there, dark brown skin steady under the courtroom's fluorescent light, his close-cropped hair combed flat that morning by his mother's own hand at 6 a.m., and said nothing at all. What Judge Bledsoe did not know, what nobody in that gallery, not the parents laughing along, not the bailiff who'd caught the joke and passed it along with his eyes, knew, was what sat recorded, in triplicate, in a county facilities, filed 3 floors up in that very building, a lease agreement renewed every 5 years since Elijah's grandfather had first swept these same marble floors as a young man. The judge thought it was funny. Then the boy looked at his mother and said, "Should I tell him?" Camille Dunbar sat in the 3rd row of that gallery in a plain grey suit, hands folded in her lap the way she had trained herself to sit through every courtroom, every boardroom, every meeting in her adult life where she needed the room to underestimate her for exactly as long as it took to be useful. She was 39 years old, tall, with the same steady dark brown complexion she'd passed down to her son. Her hair pulled back in a low, simple twist, and she had not said a single word since the bailiff called her son's docket number 20 minutes earlier, because she had learned, watching men like Hammond Bledsoe operate for most of her adult life, that the worst thing a black mother could do in a courtroom like this one was give a room full of strangers a reason to write her off as difficult before she'd even opened her mouth. She had heard the joke about the tray. She had watched 3 parents behind her laugh along with it, not out of cruelty exactly, just the easy, thoughtless complicity of people who had never once had to calculate the cost of a judge's mood before. She felt her jaw tighten and did not let it reach her face. What no one in that courtroom yet understood, and what Elijah's 4 soft words were about to begin unraveling, was that the building they were all sitting in, the county's juvenile annex courthouse at 4th and Main, marble floors and all, was not, and had never been, owned by the county at all. Camille's father, Reuben Dunbar, had spent 22 years as head custodian of that same building, back when it had housed a mid-sized insurance office instead of a courtroom, mopping those same marble floors every night from 11 to 7, a broad-shouldered man with skin a deep, warm brown gone permanently sun-weathered from a childhood spent picking tobacco before he ever picked up a mop, hands scarred from decades of industrial cleaning chemicals and machine repair. Reuben had been passed over for the building's maintenance supervisor position 4 separate times across those 22 years, each time by a younger, less experienced white man, and each time the building's ownership group had explained it away with some version of the same phrase, "Not quite ready, needs more seasoning, we just don't see him as management material," a phrase Reuben had absorbed quietly, year after year. Because a man supporting 3 children on a custodian's wage did not have the luxury of walking away from steady work over a title he'd stopped expecting. To be offered honestly, he had said one thing to Camille more than any other single sentence across the whole stretch of her childhood, sitting at the kitchen table some nights with his uniform still on, smelling of floor wax and exhaustion. "You watch how a building treats the people who keep it running," he told her once. She'd been maybe 9 years old. "Someday somebody's going to own this place who actually understands that. I won't be the one." But you remember what it looked like from the bottom, so you know exactly what to fix if you ever end up on top. Ruben had died at 60, heart failing him 3 years into a retirement he'd barely gotten to enjoy. And Camille, 31 that year and 11 years into a career in commercial real estate finance that had started with the same stubborn refusal to accept not quite ready that her father had absorbed his whole working life, had made herself a promise at his funeral that took 8 more years, and a great deal of quiet, patient work to fully keep. Camille remembered her father's funeral the way she remembered very little else from that year, grief having blurred most of the surrounding weeks into a single grey smear. But the funeral itself stayed sharp. The particular weight of the casket, the way 3 of Ruben's old co-workers from the building had shown up in their own work uniforms out of a kind of quiet solidarity nobody had asked them for, and the moment standing at the graveside when her mother had pressed the cedar keyring box into her hands and said only, "He kept this in his truck his whole life. Never told me why. I think he was waiting for the right person to give it to." Camille had not understood at 31 what her mother meant by the right person. She had taken the keyring anyway and carried it into the small real estate finance firm where she was at the time one of only 2 black analysts on a floor of 40, learning the mechanics of commercial acquisition the same patient, deliberate way her father had once learned a building's every fuse box and water line by staying later than anyone expected, by asking the question twice when the first answer felt incomplete, by refusing to let not quite ready become the permanent verdict on her career the way it had been on his. She had built Dunbar Properties from a single small office acquisition at 32 into a firm that, by 39, held title to 11 commercial buildings across the county. Financed through relationships she'd spent a decade cultivating with lenders who had, more than once, needed convincing that a black woman running her own acquisition fund deserved the same benefit of the doubt any man in the same meeting would have gotten automatically. 6 years earlier, when the county's juvenile court division outgrew its old downtown facility and put out a request for lease proposals on a mid-sized office building suitable for conversion into courtroom space, Camille had submitted a bid on the 4th and Main building through Dunbar Properties, not knowing at first, until she walked the site herself for the appraisal, that it was the very same building her father had mopped for 22 years, its marble floors unchanged, its old service elevator still bearing, underneath 3 decades of repenting, the same dent Ruben had once shown her as a girl, put there by a delivery cart he'd wrestled with in 1991. The appraisal walkthrough, 6 years earlier, had undone her more than she'd expected it to. She remembered standing in the old service elevator that day with a structural engineer and a leasing attorney, both of them focused entirely on load capacity and code compliance, while she ran her thumb along a dent in the door panel that neither of them had any reason to notice, a small, private recognition that closed a loop she hadn't known. Until that exact moment, she'd still been carrying open. She had not told either of them what the dent meant. She had simply finished the walkthrough, gone back to her office, and revised Dunbar Properties' bid upward by 4% that same afternoon, telling her chief financial officer only that the building was worth more to the firm than the comparables suggested, which was true, though not in any way a spreadsheet could have captured. She had won that lease bid on merit, competitive terms against 2 other bidders, and Dunbar Properties had held title to the building, and the county's juvenile annex court had operated as its tenant. For 6 years running, a $340,000 annual lease, renewed once already, and due for its second renewal that very spring, a fact that exactly nobody in that courtroom, including Judge Bledsoe, had any reason to know, because tenant judges did not typically concern themselves with who signed their building's lease. She had never once, in 8 years of running Dunbar Properties, expected that keeping the building at 4th and Main would matter for a reason so far outside real estate itself, and she thought, more than once in the months after Elijah's hearing, about how easily she might have declined that original lease bid 6 years earlier, chasing a cleaner acquisition elsewhere instead of walking back into the exact building that had shaped her whole understanding of what fairness cost a person who didn't have the paper to back it up. Camille kept in a small cedar box in her office desk drawer, the one object she had carried to every acquisition closing she'd ever attended, every difficult negotiation, every meeting where she'd needed a private reminder of exactly why the work mattered. Her father's original custodial keyring, 22 brass keys worn smooth from 2 decades of use, most of them now obsolete, fitting locks that had long since been replaced. Kept anyway because the ring itself, heavy and real in her palm, had never once stopped meaning what it meant. A gavel doesn't outrank a deed, she told herself the morning of Elijah's hearing, sliding the keyring into her coat pocket before she left the house. It just makes more noise. She had not known, driving to that hearing, how literally she would need to remember it before the morning was through. Elijah's hearing had been scheduled, on paper, as a minor juvenile diversion matter, a school cafeteria incident 3 weeks earlier in which another 7th grader, a boy named Tyler Brennan, had shoved Elijah twice from behind while he stood in the lunch line. The second shove had enough to knock a tray from Elijah's own hands and send it clattering across 3 feet of cafeteria floor, at which point Elijah, according to 2 separate teacher statements filed with the school district, had turned and pushed the tray he still held in his other hand toward Tyler's chest in a single defensive motion, food and all, before either boy could be separated by the lunch monitor. The school's own incident report characterized it, in writing, as a mutual altercation initiated by Tyler, with Elijah's response falling within the district's own definition of reasonable self-defense. The morning had started for Camille hours before the hearing itself, with a 6 a.m. ritual she'd performed with a steadiness that surprised even her, pressing Elijah's shirt collar flat, checking the knot of a necktie he'd only worn twice before, running through, out loud, exactly what he could expect to happen inside a courtroom he'd never once set foot in prior to that morning. She had chosen his clothes deliberately. The blazer a size too large, not out of any oversight, but because she wanted him dressed like a boy, still growing into himself, rather than a boy trying too hard to look like something he wasn't. A small, careful calculation she made instinctively. The way she made most decisions involving how the world would read her son before he'd said a single word to it. Whatever happens in there, she told him in the car, you tell the truth, plainly the way we practiced. You don't raise your voice even if he raises his. You let me handle anything that isn't a direct question to you. What if he's not fair? Elijah asked, watching the courthouse come into view through the windshield. Then, we deal with that after, Camille said. Today, you just tell the truth. Judge Bledsoe had, in the 20 minutes before Camille and Elijah's docket number was called, already moved through 4 other juvenile matters that morning with a visible weary impatience, and it was clear, watching him from the 3rd row, that he had decided, somewhere in his own private calculus, exactly what kind of morning this was going to be, and exactly which of the children appearing, before him fit which role in it. Camille had watched him read that file, or fail to, with the same practiced attention she'd once trained on closing documents across a boardroom table, counting the seconds a stranger spent deciding her worth before he'd bothered to fully learn it. An old, unwelcome habit her career had never quite let her set down, even outside the rooms that required it. You threw a tray at another student, Bledsoe said, reading from a file he had, by Camille's careful count, spent less than 40 seconds actually reviewing. Deliberately, in front of witnesses. I don't especially care what the school's paperwork says about who started it. I've got a boy who put food on another child in a room full of teachers. And I've got a stack of these cafeteria incidents on my docket every single month, mostly from young men who look a lot like you, if we're being honest about the pattern. The quiet ally in that courtroom that morning was a young public defender named Marcus Odell. No relation to the apprentice on any construction site. Simply a name common enough in that county that two Marcus Odells had grown up 4 miles apart, without ever meeting. 28 years old, lean, his own skin a warm bronze brown. 3 years into a public defender's caseload that ran, most weeks, to more than 80 active juvenile files at once. He had met Elijah for the first time 11 minutes before the hearing started, in a hallway outside the courtroom, and had done, in those 11 minutes, the one small kindness that would matter more than either of them yet understood. He had knelt down to Elijah's eye level, told him plainly and without condescension exactly what to expect inside, and said, before the bailiff called them in, whatever he says up there, you did the right thing pushing that tray back. Don't let his tone convince you otherwise, not even for a second. Elijah had carried that sentence into the courtroom with him, and it was, Camille would understand only later, at least part of why her son had stood so steady under a joke designed to make him feel small in front of a room full of strangers. Marcus had learned, 3 years into a caseload that never seemed to shrink no matter how many hours he added to it, to give whatever attention he could in whatever window a case allowed him, and Elijah's file, thin as it was, had troubled him from the first read through the night before. A documented self-defense incident, cleared by the school's own investigation, somehow still landing on a formal juvenile docket, instead of being dismissed at intake the way comparable files usually were. He had flagged it to his supervising attorney that same evening, only to be told the officer's caseload made a deeper pre-hearing review impossible before morning, a limitation Marcus carried into that hallway conversation with Elijah as its own quiet frustration. One more file he wished he'd had more than 11 minutes to properly prepare. I looked at your case last night, Marcus told Elijah, still crouched at his eye level. I believe what the school wrote down. I need you to believe it too, no matter what gets said in there today. Elijah had nodded, solemn, the particular solemnity of a boy who had already decided, on his own, days before that hearing, that he had done nothing wrong, and did not intend to perform an apology he didn't owe. If it pleased the court, Marcus said. Standing beside Elijah, at the defense table, the school's own incident report, filed the same day, documents Tyler Brennan as the initiating party in 2 separate physical contacts. My client's response was a single defensive action, and the school district itself has already declined to pursue any disciplinary action against him. I'd respectfully ask the court to consider the full record before I've seen the full record, counselor, Bledsoe said, not looking up. I don't need a lecture on what I've already read. He had not in fact read past the file's first page, a detail the courtroom's own audio recording system, running as it did on every proceeding in that building per county policy, would later confirm beyond any argument, capturing 31 seconds of silence between his stated review and his verdict, far too brief a window for the 11-page file to have actually been read. If you've ever watched a room decide who deserves patience and who doesn't before a single fact has finished being presented, you already know the particular helplessness of sitting in that gallery, watching your own child absorb a joke he did nothing to earn. Bledsoe's escalation came less than 4 minutes later, and it raised the stakes past anything the morning's paperwork had originally called for. Given the pattern I'm seeing on my docket lately, Bledsoe said, I'm referring this matter for a formal disciplinary hearing rather than accepting it as a diversion case. That means a record, counselor. The kind that follows a young man past middle school if we're not careful about nipping this sort of thing early. He said it lightly, almost cheerfully, the tone of a man handing down a minor inconvenience rather than what it actually was, a juvenile record recommendation disproportionate, by any measure Marcus had seen in 3 years of practice, to a documented case of proven self-defense against an unprovoked physical assault. Marcus stood again, more urgency in his voice this time. Your Honor, respectfully, that recommendation isn't supported by anything in the record. The school district found no wrongdoing. A formal disciplinary referral here would be, Counselor, Bledsoe said, I've made my ruling. I'd suggest you save your energy for a case where the facts are actually in dispute. The 5 seconds before Camille rose stretched for her far longer than 5 seconds actually lasted. She felt the same calculation she'd run 1,000 times before in 1,000 other rooms, the cost of speaking against the cost of staying silent. The particular arithmetic a black woman learns early and never entirely stops running, no matter how much power she eventually accumulates, and she felt, underneath it, her son's eyes finding hers across the gallery rail, the 4 words he'd half-whispered still hanging between them. Should I tell him? She understood, in that instant, that the question wasn't really his to answer alone. Not at 12 years old, not standing at a defense table with a formal disciplinary referral just handed down against him. It was hers. It was Camille who rose then, not out of any plan, not out of the calculation she'd spent 20 minutes carefully maintaining, but out of the same instinct that had carried her father through 22 years of being told not quite ready and had carried her. 8 years after his funeral, through every closing table where a room full of men had needed convincing she belonged in it. Your Honor, Camille said, standing, her voice even, carrying without needing to be raised. May I be heard? I'm Elijah's mother. Bledsoe's overreach, the third and final act, arrived in the space of the next 20 seconds, and it was entirely his own doing. Ma'am, sit down, Bledsoe said, not looking at her directly, addressing instead the middle distance above her head, the way a man does when he has already decided a person isn't worth his full attention. This is a legal proceeding, not a town hall. If you have concerns, your son's attorney can file them in writing. I don't allow parents to editorialize from the gallery in my courtroom, and I especially don't allow it after I've already ruled. He glanced toward the bailiff standing near the courtroom side door, a heavy-set older man named Gerald Askew, who had worked security in that building for 9 years. Bailiff, if this continues, please escort her out. Have you ever watched a room's certainty collapse in the exact order it was built? Gerald Askew took 1 step toward Camille, the way protocol required, and stopped, his eyes catching something in her face, or perhaps simply catching the name Elijah had, moments earlier, half whispered to his mother across the gallery rail. Should I tell him? A question Elijah had asked not out of defiance, but because he had, in fact, recognized his mother's face doing the thing it did right before she decided a room needed correcting, and had wanted, in his own quiet 12-year-old way, to give her the opening. Gerald had worked that building's security detail long enough to have attended, 18 months earlier, a tenant facilities briefing in the building management office 2 floors up. A routine annual meeting where Dunbar Properties senior staff walked the county's court administrators and their security team through emergency evacuation protocols, fire suppression system updates, and building access procedures, a meeting at which Camille Dunbar herself had stood at the front of the room, name placard in front of her, explaining exactly which exits led where. Gerald stopped mid-step, turned his head slightly toward the court clerk seated near the bench, and said something low, meant to carry no further than the 2 of them. Though the courtroom had gone quiet enough by then that the words reached at least the first 3 rows. That's Mrs. Dunbar, Gerald said. She owns this building. Gerald Askew's own understanding of the moment arrived in pieces, the way real recognition often does under pressure rather than all at once. He had noticed, first, only that the woman objecting from the gallery carried herself with an authority that didn't match the deference the room seemed to expect of her. The particular steadiness Gerald had, in 9 years of courthouse security, learned to associate with people who held real standing somewhere, even when he couldn't yet place where. It was her face, more than her words, that finally completed the recognition. A face he'd seen exactly once before, 18 months earlier, standing at the front of a facility's briefing room, explaining fire suppression protocols with the same unhurried clarity she was using now to correct a sitting judge. He thought, in the half-second before he spoke, about his own 2 grandchildren, about what he would want a bailiff to do if either of them ever stood at a defense table the way Elijah Dunbar was standing at one now. And the thought settled the matter for him faster than any protocol manual could have. The courtroom's silence changed texture entirely in the space of that single sentence. The particular quiet of a room recalculating everything it had assumed only seconds before. Judge Bledsoe's expression, Camille would later describe to her sister, did something she had watched happen exactly twice before in her career. Both times at closing tables, where a man's certainty about who held the power in the room collided, in real time, with the paperwork proving otherwise. "I'm sorry, you what?" Bledsoe said. "I own the building this courtroom sits in," Your Honor, Camille said, still standing, still even, still exactly as composed as she'd been 20 minutes earlier, when the room had been laughing at her son instead of reckoning with her. Dunbar Properties has held title for 6 years. The county leases this space from my firm at $340,000 annually. A lease currently under renewal review, a review I happen to sit on personally. I'm also, as it happens, Elijah Dunbar's mother, which is the only fact in this room that should actually matter to how you've conducted the last 20 minutes, and it isn't the fact you responded to. Bledsoe's mouth opened and closed once before anything useful came out of it. I wasn't informed of any ownership relationship. That's not something typically disclosed to sitting judges. No, Camille said. It isn't. I didn't come here today to disclose it either. I came here because my son was accused of something the school itself already investigated and cleared him of, and I sat quietly in that gallery for 20 minutes while you decided, without finishing the file in front of you, that he fit a pattern you'd already made up your mind about before he ever opened his mouth. The building ownership isn't the story here, Your Honor. It's just the reason this room finally started listening. The county's court administrator, a careful woman named Denise Prewitt, who had been standing near the courtroom's rear entrance for the last several minutes of the proceeding, having arrived for an unrelated scheduling matter, and stayed once she sensed the morning's tension building, stepped forward now, her own expression caught somewhere between professional alarm and dawning understanding. Your Honor, Denise said, I think we need to pause this proceeding. If there's a documented ownership relationship between the presiding party and the building housing this court, and separately a question about whether the full case record was reviewed prior to ruling, both of those need to go on record before anything further happens here today. There's no conflict, Bledsoe said, too quickly, the volume itself a tell. I run this courtroom the way I've run it for 11 years, and I don't answer to a landlord about how you don't answer to me at all, Your Honor, Camille said. That's not what's happening here, and I'd ask you not to characterize it that way in front of my son. What you do answer to is the county's Judicial Conduct Commission and this building's own audio recording system, which has captured every word said in this room this morning, including the 31 seconds you spent not reading an 11-page file before ruling on my son's future. Marcus Odell, standing at the defense table with an expression somewhere between vindication and disbelief, spoke up for the first time since Camille had risen. Your Honor, given everything just entered into the record, I'm formally requesting this ruling be vacated pending review, and I'm requesting the full audio transcript be preserved and released to my office immediately. Denise Prewitt nodded, already reaching for her own phone. That transcript request is granted as a matter of standard procedure, effective now. Judge Bledsoe, I'd strongly recommend you recess this docket for the day. Bledsoe looked, for a moment, like a man calculating whether some version of his old authority could still be salvaged if he simply pushed forward, the particular arithmetic of a man who had spent 11 years on that bench, never once having to answer, in real time, for a ruling made in under a minute. He found, looking out at a gallery that had gone entirely silent, no ally anywhere in it. Not in the parents who'd laughed along with his stray joke 20 minutes earlier and now sat very still. Not in Gerald Askew, who had stepped back to his post near the side door, with his own expression carefully blank. Not in the court clerk, who had already begun the formal notation the recess required. "This docket is recessed," Bledsoe said, and left the bench without another word. Past the same gallery, the same laughter he'd invited minutes before, now cuddled into a silence no ruling of his could talk its way back out of. Denise Pruitt's own account of that morning, given later to the Commission's investigators, described a decision she'd made almost entirely on instinct, drawing on 14 years of court administration experience that had taught her exactly how quickly a proceeding's legitimacy could unravel once its own record contradicted its own ruling. "I've seen judges push through hearings faster than the file warranted before," she told the investigators. "I'd never seen it collide, in real time, with a fact this undeniable. I made the call to pause, because the alternative was letting a ruling stand that I already knew, listening in that room, wasn't going to survive a single honest review." Camille drove Elijah home that afternoon, in a silence neither of them rushed to fill, the particular exhausted quiet that follows an adrenaline surge finally draining out of a body. It was Elijah, watching the courthouse shrink in the side mirror, who finally spoke. "Were you scared?" he asked. "Standing up like that?" "A little," Camille said. "Being right doesn't always feel brave in the moment you're doing it. Sometimes it just feels like the only thing left standing to do." "I wasn't scared," Elijah said, "until you actually stood up. Then I was, because I honestly didn't know what was about to happen next." "Neither did I," Camille admitted. "I only knew what needed to happen right then. That's not always the same thing as knowing exactly what comes after it." The county's Judicial Conduct Commission opened a formal inquiry the following week, triggered by Marcus's transcript request and Denise Pruitt's own mandatory reporting obligation as court administrator, reviewing not only the audio of Elijah's hearing, but, once the pattern Bledsoe had referenced so casually on the record, drew scrutiny. 6 additional juvenile cases from that same docket over the preceding 18 months, 4 of which showed strikingly similar review times under a minute, 3 of which involved Black or Latino defendants receiving disciplinary referrals disproportionate to white defendants' outcomes on comparable incident reports. Camille did not push for the harshest possible outcome available to her, though her attorney, reviewing the Commission's preliminary findings with her 2 weeks later, told her plainly she had grounds to. "I want the ruling on Elijah's case vacated and the record expunged," Camille said. "I want the pattern investigated fully, and I want it made public if the findings support that. I don't need Harmon Bledsoe's career destroyed beyond what his own conduct earns him. I won't do to him what he tried to do to my son in front of a room full of strangers. That's the difference between us, and I intend to keep it that way." The 3 months between the inquiry's opening and its findings were, for Camille, an exercise in the same patience her father had modeled his whole working life, watching a slow institutional process grind forward on its own necessary timeline rather than the timeline her own anger might have preferred. She checked in with her attorney every few weeks, reviewed each interim filing carefully, and resisted, more than once, the urge to push publicly for a faster or harsher outcome, because she understood, from a decade spent building a company inside institutions that rarely moved quickly for anyone, that a process rushed by outside pressure was a process vulnerable to being undone the same way later. Elijah's own disciplinary referral was formally vacated within the first 2 weeks of the inquiry, his record expunged of the incident entirely, a resolution that arrived quietly, by mail, in an envelope Camille kept afterward in the same cedar box as her father's keyring, a small, official piece of paper that had cost far more than its plain language suggested to finally obtain. The Commission's findings, released 3 months later, resulted in Bledsoe's formal censure and a mandatory judicial bias training requirement across the county's juvenile court system, alongside a supervised review of every disciplinary referral on his docket for the preceding 2 years, short of removal from the bench, though Camille's attorney noted, reading the final report, that a second substantiated complaint within the following 18 months would almost certainly end differently. The grace bit extended further than Bledsoe, though he was the only one in that courtroom who'd earned none of it. Denise Pruitt, whose quick, procedurally correct intervention had preserved the transcript and triggered the formal review, received, the following month, a personal note from Camille, along with an offer, a seat if she wanted it, on the small advisory board Dunbar Properties maintained for its public sector tenant relationships, a role Denise accepted, telling Camille it was the first time in 14 years of court administration that a building owner had asked her opinion about anything beyond a maintenance request. Gerald Askew, the bailiff whose single whispered sentence had turned the whole courtroom certainty on its axis, received a handwritten card from Camille the following week, along with tickets to a county fair he'd mentioned, in passing, wanting to take his grandkids to that fall. "You didn't have to say my name out loud," Camille wrote. "Most people in your position would have just followed the order and let the room sort itself out later. I won't forget that you didn't." The findings, once released, prompted a wave of local coverage that Camille had neither sought nor entirely welcomed. A reporter from the regional paper calling her office twice in the same week, asking for an interview about what one headline had already, without her input, started calling the courthouse she owns. Camille declined the interview twice before finally agreeing to a brief, carefully worded statement, less because she wanted the attention, and more because she understood, reading the Commission's full report, that the pattern uncovered in Bledsoe's docket, the disproportionate outcomes across 6 additional cases, the consistent gap in review time between white and black defendants' files, deserved to be known by parents on that docket who had no way of independently discovering it themselves. "I'm not interested in being anyone's symbol," she told the reporter when the statement finally ran. "I'm interested in the fact that 6 other families went through some version of what my son went through, and most of them will never know it happened because they didn't happen to own the building." That's the actual story here, not me. Marcus Odell's payoff came differently and more substantially. Camille, learning over the following weeks just how many juvenile cases moved through that docket with a public defender's office stretched across 80 active files at once, made a direct donation to the county public defender's office, earmarked specifically for juvenile division staffing, large enough to fund 2 additional attorney positions, one of which Marcus was offered outright as a senior role, with a caseload finally sized to let him do for other children what he'd managed to do for Elijah in 11 rushed hallway minutes. "You knelt down and talked to him like a person instead of a case number," Camille told him, the day she made the offer. "That's rarer in this system than people want to admit. I'd like to see what you do with more time to do it properly." Marcus took the position that fall and reduced his own caseload from 80 active files to a more sustainable 22, a change he attributed, at his own swearing in for the new role, directly to a 12-year-old he'd known for exactly 11 hallway minutes before a hearing that changed the shape of his entire career. He kept a copy of Elijah's expunged case file, redacted of anything identifying, in his own desk drawer afterward, the way Camille kept her father's keyring, a reminder of the exact cost a rushed system exacted on children who had done nothing wrong. The 2 additional attorney positions Camille's donation funded were filled by Winter, both hires drawn specifically from candidates with juvenile defense experience, and the office's average caseload across its juvenile division dropped within a year from just under 80 files per attorney to just under 30, a change the county's own annual court efficiency report would later cite, without naming Camille directly, as the single largest staffing improvement the public defender's office had seen in over a decade. Marcus Odell testified before the commission that summer as well, laying out for the record exactly how thin his caseload had left his ability to prepare for hearings like Elijah's, a detail the commission's final report cited directly in recommending the county allocate additional public defender funding, independent of anything Camille herself later chose to contribute. The system doesn't just fail children when a judge doesn't read the file, Marcus told the panel. It fails them earlier than that, when the attorney assigned to defend them has 80 other files competing for the same 11 minutes I gave Elijah in a hallway. The county's second lease renewal review, the one Camille had mentioned aloud in the courtroom that morning, almost as an afterthought, concluded that same summer with terms largely unchanged, though Camille insisted, over her own leasing attorney's mild objection that the clause wasn't strictly necessary for a 5-year commercial lease, on adding a provision requiring the county to maintain published, auditable review time standards for every docket housed in the building. A small structural change that outlived the controversy that prompted it, and that Denise Pruitt, in her new advisory role, helped design specifically to make the kind of 31-second review that had nearly cost Elijah his record far harder to repeat unnoticed. 6 months later, the juvenile annex courthouse at 4th and Main operated under a new presiding judge, and Camille Dunbar, walking the building's marble floors on a routine tenant relations visit that spring, stopped at the old service elevator on the 2nd floor, its door still bearing, beneath decades of repainting, the faint outline of a dent her father had shown her as a girl. She had commissioned, that same spring, a small brass plaque mounted beside the elevator, easy to miss unless you already knew to look for it, reading only Reuben Dunbar, head custodian, 1979 to 2001. He kept this building running long before he ever got the credit for it. She had considered, briefly, mounting it somewhere more visible, near the main entrance where every visitor to the courthouse would pass it, before deciding, in the end, that the quiet placement suited her father better than any prominent one would have. He had never once, in 22 years, sought recognition loudly. She saw no reason to force it on his memory now. The new presiding judge, a woman named Nadine Corbett, who had spent 9 years in juvenile defense herself before taking the bench, had reached out to Camille personally within her first month, not out of any obligation, but because she had read the commission's full findings and wanted, she said, to understand exactly what the building's tenants had actually experienced sitting in that gallery before she ever presided over a single case in it herself. The 2 women had walked the courtroom together on a quiet Saturday morning, no docket running, just the 2 of them and the marble floor Reuben Dunbar had once kept polished to a shine nobody in a hurry ever noticed. "I want this room to feel different than it did that morning," Nadine told her. "Not because a plaque tells people to feel differently, because the way cases actually get heard here is different now." "That's the only kind of change that ever holds," Camille said. She kept her father's original keyring in the cedar box in her office desk drawer still, 22 brass keys worn smooth from 2 decades of a working man's hands, though she had added, that spring, one further object to the box beside it, a printed excerpt of the courtroom's own audio transcript, the 31 seconds of silence before Judge Bledsoe's ruling, highlighted in yellow, kept not out of any lingering anger, but as a reminder, the same kind her father's keyring had always served, of exactly what the work was actually for, and of how easily 31 careless seconds could could still, even now, undo what should have taken far longer to decide. A gavel doesn't outrank a deed, she told Elijah that spring. The two of them standing together in front of his grandfather's new plaque. It just makes more noise. Elijah, 13 now, read the plaque twice, quiet in the same steady way he'd stood in that courtroom months earlier, and asked his mother after a while whether his grandfather had ever known, in his own lifetime, that a building like this one could someday belong to somebody who looked like the two of them standing in front of it. I don't think he let himself hope for it, Camille said. I think he just made sure I'd know what to fix, in case I ever got the chance he never got. That's its own kind of faith, even if it doesn't look like the kind people usually mean by that word. Elijah asked, after a while longer standing in front of the plaque, whether he could keep one of the keys from the ring someday, once he was old enough that his mother trusted him with it. Camille considered the question longer than its size seemed to warrant, turning the cedar box over once in her hands before she answered. When you're old enough to understand what it actually cost to get here, she said, not just old enough to want it. Those aren't always the same birthday. Elijah nodded, the same solemn nod he'd carried into a courtroom months earlier, and didn't push the question further, which told her, more than anything else that spring, that he already understood more of what she meant than most 13-year-olds would have. Camille thought often, in the months that followed, about how differently that morning might have unfolded if Gerald Askew had simply followed the order without hesitation, if Denise Pruitt had chosen the easier path of letting the ruling stand rather than risking her own professional discomfort to pause it, if Marcus Odell had spent his 11 hallway minutes on paperwork instead of kneeling, down to a frightened 12-year-old's eye level. None of what happened that morning had required her ownership of the building at all. Not really. It had only required a handful of people, in the room already, willing to notice a fact and act on it instead of looking away. The building had simply made the noticing impossible to ignore once it finally surfaced. That's the whole of it, and maybe the only lesson worth carrying out of it. Power that waits quietly to be needed is not weakness, and a child's steadiness under an unearned joke is not the same as consent to it. A room's respect, offered only once it discovers who holds the paper, was never really respect at all. It was fear finally catching up to a fact that should have mattered from the very first word spoken in that courtroom. The same fact that should have mattered even if Camille Dunbar had owned nothing at all beyond the right to be heard as a mother defending her son. Dignity, held long enough and quiet enough, patiently enough, tends to outlast whatever cruelty tries to laugh it out of the room in the space of a single careless morning. Talent and standing were never scarce in that gallery, or in any courtroom like it, on any docket, in any county. What was scarce for 22 years of Ruben Dunbar's working life, and for 20 minutes of his grandson's, was somebody with real power, willing to stop, listen fully, and act on what the record actually said, instead of what a room's easy assumptions had already decided before a single fact finished being read into it. Who was the first person who believed in you before anyone else could see it? Tell us below, and tell us plainly where you're listening from tonight. If this story moved you, share it with somebody who's still standing steady under a joke they didn't earn, the way Elijah did, and with somebody who once stood quietly in a gallery of their own, hands folded, patient, waiting for the exact right moment to finally rise and be heard. Wherever you are tonight, in whatever room is currently underestimating you, may the paper finally catch up to the truth of you, and may somebody, someday, whisper your name in a room that finally has every reason in the world to listen.